Americans for Fair Taxation presents the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, president of Americans for Fair Taxation, and recorded by Bob Paxton, a volunteer with the Florida Fair Tax Educational Association. And now, this week's Chairman's Report.
Hello, I'm Bob Paxton with the AFFT Chairman's Report for Friday, August 7th, 2020. Why California needs to rely more on sales taxes. Gerald Parsky is the chairman of Aurora Capital Partners, which is based in California. In 2009, Mr. Parsky chaired a bipartisan commission that recommended that California reduce its state income tax rate and expand the sales and use tax to include taxing services. On July 10, 2020, the Wall Street Journal published an article entitled, "California Wants a Federal Bailout? Tax Reform Must Come First." Mr. Parsky pointed out the following. California is facing a $54 billion budget deficit, equivalent to 37% of the total budget. Governor Newsom is blaming the problem on COVID-19 shutdowns. The unemployment rate is officially 16.3%, but may rise as high as 24.5%. California's personal income is predicted to decline by at least 9%. The result is a $41 billion decline in revenues to the state. Now, California housing costs are about 2.5 times the national average, and it has a costly regulatory environment for businesses. In 2019, California's population grew by only 0.2%, the lowest annual rate since 1900. A survey of California residents showed that a whopping 53% of them are considering leaving the state. Now, Mr. Parsky is recommending that before the federal government just starts writing checks to California, that it require the state to institute reforms like his commission proposed. He concludes his article by saying, quoting now, "Comprehensive tax reform would be a powerful antidote to those budget problems. It would put the state's finances on stronger footing and make California a more attractive destination for investment and entrepreneurship," end of quote. Now let's look at the fair tax in California. If California did an analysis of the type of tax plan that would fund their state government in the most efficient way possible and help both employers and employees in California, they would likely find that a state version of the fair tax would be an excellent choice. Now, that's exactly what Georgia, Alabama, and Nebraska found and are working to implement. Now, let's look at evasion. The increasing evasion of the federal income payroll tax is one of the major reasons that California needs to change its tax system. Californians paid over $234 billion in 2017. Now, that's about 15% of the national total of income payroll taxes collected. Now, people who evade federal income taxes also evade their state's income tax because the states and the IRS share data. If, as Professor Sebula's study indicates, the evasion rate is around 15%, tax evasion is costing California close to $40 billion. Now, the following is from a report entitled Addressing the Tax Gap, published by the California Board of Equalization. Quoting again, "The Board of Equalization administers 34 tax and fee programs, 32 of which produce revenues of $50.7 billion annually for the state. The sales and use tax is the largest tax program, comprising over 83% of the total revenues. This plan focuses on the sales and use tax gap. The Sales and Use Tax Department produced revenues of about $42.2 billion in fiscal year 2019-10, and we've estimated that the taxes paid amount to about 95% of the total taxes owed. The tax gap is estimated to be about 5% of that $42.2 billion, or approximately $2.3 billion. Now, there are three major components of the tax gap. One is tax use liabilities, businesses and individual consumers not required to be registered. Number two is non-filers and evaders. And number three, registered taxpayers underreporting or just not paying at all. Now, this study establishes that in California, evasion is much less of a problem with their sales tax than with their state income tax. Evasion and the resulting loss of income is a problem that will only grow for both the federal government and for all of the states that rely on an income tax to fund their government operations. Now let's look at fairness. Although California politicians routinely complain that their lowest income residents are not being treated fairly, they ignore the negative impact on these citizens caused by the state's sales tax, which ranges from 7.25% to 8.25% depending on where you live. Now, the California sales tax exempts most food purchases and medical expenses. However, just about every other purchase, including used items, is subject to the tax. If California politicians were really concerned about their low-income citizens, they would be seriously considering putting in a state version of the fair tax. Now here's why. The prebate would exempt many of their lower-income citizens from paying any sales tax at all. Eliminating the state income tax would encourage growth in private industry, which would lead to more and better-paying jobs, which would lead to more spending and more revenue to the state coffers. Now, like people everywhere, the great majority of California citizens say they want a good job that pays enough to provide a decent standard of living for their families. Now, what they're really saying is that they want to have enough left over after taxes to provide a good living for themselves and their families. Now, let's look at California's competitive advantage. Now, California is losing business to Nevada. Now, one of the reasons is that Nevada does not have a state income tax. It's been shown conclusively that states that don't have a state income tax are more attractive to both businesses and individuals. California has a marvelous climate, and for decades this has been enough to attract people to the state in spite of its broken tax system. But now the system has become so broken that many Californians are looking to flee the state in order to escape its oppressive taxation. The stark reality is that fewer and fewer people believe that they can maintain their financial solvency in the Golden State. For them, the choice is simple: move out of state or suffer financial ruin. In conclusion, Winston Churchill said, "You can always count on Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else." Now, the ruling class in California and the ruling class in D.C. share the same attitude. Their own best interests are more important than the people's best interests. Their only worry is that the people will catch on to what they're doing, at which point they can no longer get away with it. Now, why would any government not want to have a tax system, the fair tax, that allows its citizens to be more prosperous and less dependent on the government? Well, the answer to that may be one that most of us don't want to confront. Many in government like the idea of citizens being dependent on the government. That gives them power and control over people's lives that they wouldn't otherwise have. Now, the fair tax benefits the economy and the American people, and the choice is simple. Do you want to benefit the American people or the ruling class and their minions in D.C.? Now, we've tried everything else. Now we need to do the right thing. Pass the fair tax. So if you're ready to take a very significant step towards taking control of your government back from a small group of corrupt people and making it possible for all to prosper, go to FAIRtax.org, watch the whiteboards under how it works, and then if you agree, please join us. Then contact your members of Congress and the President and demand that Congress pass the fair tax, the only truly fair tax.
This has been the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, President of Americans for Fair Taxation. Check back every week for news and information about the fair tax, and learn why the fair tax should replace our antiquated federal income tax system. If you'd like to receive a copy of the Chairman's Report in your inbox every week, sign up at FAIRtax.org.